give 3 questions for this discussion in this session, and I think they're even more pertinent since the events of Wednesday across Europe than they were when the organisers wrote them. And I'll just move straight to the very first question, which is, does the challenge to state sovereignty posed by globalisation make closer European integration more compelling? Now, I think from the beginning of the EU, or the EEC as it then was, there was a widespread sense amongst political leaders, including in the United Kingdom and the interested public, that pooling powers, as they called it, enabled states to act more effectively in achieving and maintaining a good society. That is one of, just like the United Irishmen looked for, one of security, justice and solidarity and so on. And even then, most nationalist movements in the member states, though not all nationalist movements, they also recognised that the modern world was necessarily interdependent. And in the late 1970s, for example, the Scottish National Party developed a policy of independence in Europe, and that was replicated in other nationalist parties. Now, as we've heard today, the idea that sovereignty was more effective when pooled has very much disappeared from the mainstream of British politics. But these louder British voices are also to be heard in other countries, and I think here particularly of the Czech Republic. But if the interested citizen in the United Kingdom or anywhere else were to look to political leaders and experts for guidance about whether today's crisis does make integration more compelling, then I think he and she would be at a loss, because there's little consensus and there's a great deal of uncertainty. And if I could just recommend to you a paper produced by Linda Barry of the Institute of International and European Affairs here in Dublin, there's a very good summary of all the different understandings of what needs to be done. And broadly speaking, these analyses display either disagreement about the proper measures either taken or to be taken, that is, incrementally within existing treaties or through constitutional reform, or they do show a degree of certainty about what needs to be done, closer economic and political union, but also a sense that doing that will be impossible. And an initial confusion lies in the question of what the crisis is about. Is it the need to save the Eurozone, or is it to save the EU? Now, for a while, the two of those things seem to overlap completely, and that's hardly surprising, given the interdependence of EU economies. Saving Greece would save the euro, and that would save the union, including the non-euro members. Thus, at all costs, Greece was to be kept in the Eurozone. But things have changed from the summer. It has begun to be sort of voiced in Germany that a Greek exit, and by implication multiple departures from the Eurozone, would not be as daunting as had once seemed. Now, I leave aside for this afternoon's discussion the economic consequences of multiple exits, but this prospect is reopening significant political questions that we used to call variable geometry or multi-speed Europe. And might there be an EU polity with a federal core and with a single fiscal policy moving in the direction of political union, surrounded by a group of non-Euro states who may or may not opt into the Euro? And there is some disagreement in the explanations about whether countries will be allowed to opt in to the Euro. And then there's the question, as we've heard, the UK, with so many opt-outs that it makes almost no sense to describe it as a member or out altogether, not just because of a possible referendum along with the Scottish one, but pushed out as its demand for opt-outs become increasingly intolerable. to the other member states. Now, the idea of a United States of Europe is on the agenda of political groupings right across the spectrum in Germany. This does not stem from idealism along the lines that we've been discussing this morning, but reflects a view that political union is necessary and inevitable. And in other countries, politicians, including some EU office holders, also think that there is a compelling need to change the Treaty of Lisbon in a federal direction. But there are other politicians, and that's not just in the UK, and citizens in other countries, and citizens as opposed to elites in Germany, who, and I quote from one account I read to prepare for today, who I hope recoil from the goal of political union. And I must say I was rather cheered by what Vinnie's comments were, that maybe it's just the older voters who recoil from the goal of political union. Alan Jukes from Ireland, expert analyst now, but also former politician, he criticises the whole processes of dealing with the crisis, muddling through country-by-country approach, and points to failure to tackle the problem that in a multi-state monetary union, a monetary and fiscal problem in one country is a problem for the whole. Conversely, there's another analyst who's argued that one of the positive aspects of the euro crisis is that it has provoked Europe to engage in a profound debate on the form and degree of federalism it needs. And the idea that a degree of federalism is required lies in the need for a monetary union to have a clear enunciation of rules and competencies, not just on monetary policy, but also on fiscal policy or spending side. But the idea that the Commission could have a role in monitoring macroeconomic and fiscal policy, and that there could be sanctions on recalcitrant states from the Court of Justice, is proving unacceptable in the larger member states. And a continuing attachment to national budgetary sovereignty trumps a move to a more fiscal federalism. In any case, full fiscal federalism would, it's sometimes said, be a decisive step to political union, from which, as we've already noted, many politicians and elites over the age of 30 recoil. So what has actually been happening is, has been described as a system of governance under which debtor countries have to accept fiscal policy prescriptions and structural reforms imposed by creditor countries, while the latter remain free to conduct their own policy with no meaningful interference. And Stephen Wall, who was once a British diplomat and now he's also turned analyst, as he's recently pointed out, it's hard to detect either the political leadership in Europe or the popular support that will transform the governance of the Eurozone, and with it, the long-term political and economic prospects of Europe as a whole. And this topic of perhaps fiscal federalism or political federalism even is the subject of one of those citizens' initiatives that Jill told you about earlier, and which I should mention is on the Green Foundation Ireland's website. There's a very good handbook on European citizens' initiatives, so I do recommend that. So the next question then, do citizens feel connected to the EU in a practical and meaningful way? And I think for most of us, we all became accustomed to enjoying the fruits of integration coming via the four freedoms of the Treaty of Rome. Freedom of movement, of goods, capital, services and people, as Vinnie indicated, and the fundamental values of the European Union: respect for dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, human rights and so on. Values which flourished in all the European member states and were reclaimed in some of the newer ones, and which, as we heard today, animated the United Irishman. And I would just add a point about Daniel O'Connell. He was on the way to Rome, I think, close to his death, but died before he got there. But in Paris in 1847, he was hailed by a very large crowd of radicals who wished to pay tribute to the man who they thought of as the most successful champion of liberty and democracy in Europe. And it was the ambition in the 1960s that citizens of modern Europe would recognise their commonality and attribute their situations to their common membership of a union. And I agree with people who've indicated there can be criticisms. I think that that ideal was only partially realised. There were various class factors and other things which came into play, which didn't make it an entirely universal experience. But really now the downswing of the economic pendulum has brought about what somebody has described as an overwhelming reversal back to the national interest as our reference point for understanding the crisis. And this reversal is fueled by the language of politicians, and you'll be familiar with the notions of building firewalls to prevent contagion, and in using those sorts of words, they seem to imply that dysfunctional economies are riddled with disease and ready to poison the lifeblood of healthy economies. And this language links economic performance to a general moral character of entire political communities, and that is part of the stuff of the North-South fracture. And a weakened sense of connection with the EU is also to be found among citizens in the creditor states. I gather that in Germany, many people apparently think that they would be better off without the euro. And the German foreign minister in September of this year had to say, it echoes what was said in the previous session, what Jill said. We need to rediscover what the value of Europe is. Europe needs a new raison d'être. If Europe manages to persuade its citizens that it is a good thing, it will be possible to deal with the crisis. But the problem is that those values that imbue this building and that I mentioned earlier do not seem to have a powerful, pulling enough impact to strengthen the feeling that we're all part of the same system of solidarity. And they're not strong enough, seemingly, to make Europe, or the EU, and further integration look like a solution rather than part of the problem. And I think that's my time, John, sorry. I was going to mention in connection with the resurgence of the national interest, I was going to mention something about Catalonia, Flanders and Scotland, and I was going to leave Wales because I knew Jill was on the programme. But I think the point is that the sceptics of devolution in the United Kingdom and sceptics of the European Union, and we can bring Spain in here as well, is that they're using these movements to illustrate that what citizens really want is government closer to home, not closer and economic and political union based in Brussels, but led, as it were, by the Berlin perspective. But I think they misunderstand, and I think Jill made this sort of fairly clear. In Scotland, for example, the independence perspective is one of soft power in a multiplicity of unions or alliances, and comfortable with the idea of shared sovereignties. But the problem in the United Kingdom is that the very same politicians who want to leave the EU also defend an unreformed United Kingdom. And I think this is really putting a great problem for the 2014 referendum, because a prospect of a United Kingdom that has left the EU but remains unreformed at home could really have a very complicating impact on how people decide about the future of Scotland, as much as the spectres that are currently being raised in London and Brussels as to whether Scotland could even be a member. I turn to the last point, question, is a European Republic possible? And I have two preliminary points here. And the first is to note that a republic of the type that Nuala explained earlier requires a public space. And the second is that in asking the question, I think we should add another word and ask, is a democratic European republic possible? And you might think that my remarks so far seem pretty bleak about whether there can be a public space for the free exchange of ideas, common actions, and solidarity. I think in addition to the lack of pooling power of those values that we've all talked about, the discussion of firewalls and contagion and moral weakness really does not inform the public about what the problem is, and explaining the crisis in this way misleads them by not highlighting causal factors that are common to all states. For example, that the crisis arises from economic systems that are not particular to any one state. There may be small differences, but by and large, economic systems are common. There were serious errors in the global banking and financial services sectors, and there are design faults in the Economic and Monetary Union legislation. But I just noticed the other day a rather hopeful sign. I found by accident, really, an open letter written by two Spanish citizens called A Letter to Our Fellow European Citizens. And this was an effort to start a discussion that went beyond the stereotypes of both Northerners, stereotypes that the North has of the South, and vice versa. And it was published on the last day of October, but when I last looked 2 days ago, they're afraid to say there had only been 2 responses from it. So let me turn now to a democratic European republic. And most commentators so far have looked at the undermining of democracy in a national sense. They looked at the imposition of constraints on the internal affairs of debtor countries, thereby circumventing national voters and leading to the formation of technocratic governments in Greece and Italy. And of course there always have been from the beginning discussion of the EU's democratic deficits, the lack of opportunity for popular input, the closed-door character of decision-making institutions, the relative weakness of the European Parliament, and so on. And there have been efforts to ameliorate these defects. Well, first, the introduction of direct elections to the European Parliament, strengthening its powers, more transparency, Council of Ministers and the administration, the idea of European citizenship, and that's crucial. European citizenship is crucial to the debate in Scotland, and the counter-arguments being put forward from London and Brussels. And as I mentioned, the most recent one, the Citizens' Initiative innovation. And that last innovation really fits in with an exhortation by a trio of leading European thinkers, one of whom was Jürgen Habermas, who has always written a great deal about the European Union. And they say that European citizens need to understand that to be able to retain their welfare states and their cultural diversity, they can only do that if they pool resources to try to influence the global policy-making agenda. On the other hand, commentators seem to agree, and we've heard about this in the previous session, that the crisis has exacerbated a sense of powerlessness to shape EU policy, leading to the frustrations, I think, of direct action that we saw across Europe this past week. One commentator goes further by suggesting that these ultimatums and imposed solutions may mean more than undermining national democracy and demonstrating the ineffectiveness of EU-wide democracy. Rather, the crisis, she suggests, raises the question of whether democracy itself is, I quote, surplus to requirements in the process of deepening integration, i.e. surplus to requirements in the process of bringing about the kind of bad federalism that could come. I don't think I'd be quite so pessimistic about that prospect, and Chancellor Merkel is said to have proposed another constitutional convention on the future of Europe, an idea which attracted only lukewarm support in other capitals, and it does have obvious drawbacks. It couldn't be undertaken in time to re-establish a common public space, let alone one that could cope with the current crisis. It would involve consideration of major reforms, likely to be controversial, likely to have to lead to referendums, including in the UK, etc., etc. If a new constitutional convention were to be anything like the American constitutional building process that inspired the Society of United Irishmen, it would have to involve the public, both directly and through public debate. And I don't know if any of you have read the wonderful papers that were written on both sides of the arguments in the 18th century United States, the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers. Really fantastic. And these were published in the social media of the day, discussion points in broadsheets, and then brought together in single publications. Now, this can be done, and I take inspiration from Iceland's recent constitutional convention, which I heard the man who was on the committee, one of the committees which set it up, I was asked to respond to a conference at the Scottish Parliament earlier this year, and I was inspired by how he described how really participative it was and how really inclusive it was. And as we heard earlier, the internet was a huge help, and social media were a huge help in the process of delivering these constitutional proposals from the public. And it didn't start with "here are proposals," it asked the public what they wanted in the constitution, and then they sort of grouped the proposals together and got something out of it. Now, they also, of course, had to deal with the problem that Jill mentioned about Wales, was 5% of people in Iceland are not on the internet, but they had alternative methods of seeking their views. So, it can be done, but can it be done in time? And would it be too complicated in a public space that is the size of the 27 countries of the European Union? And I think I'll leave that for you to discuss.